By now, you should have an idea of how to create a React plus Redux application and how to structure your project, or at least this is my approach and a commonly seen approach of structuring such a project. Here's one important other thing I want to touch on before finishing this series, before finishing this basics series here. It's about asynchronous actions. So far, all our actions here are synchronous. There's no asynchronous action amongst them. They're all executed immediately. We're not fetching something from a server or anything like that. Now, in a real application, you'll oftentimes have the use case that you want to reach out to a server or have some other action which may take a couple of seconds before it finishes. And with Redux, you can handle such actions too, or specifically with third-party packages which can be added as middleware. Let's consider the following action here. When I set a name, I don't want to set it immediately. Let's say it takes a couple of seconds because we have to write it to a database and wait for the answer from the database or something like that. In this case, I don't return a JavaScript object here. Instead, I return a fat arrow function, which has one argument, which is why I can leave out the parentheses, dispatch. And this function here then has, let's say, a timer to simulate a server request which takes a couple of seconds. Here, instead of set timeout, you would reach out to the server and wait for the answer. So let's say it takes 2 seconds. Again, just to simulate that. After 2 seconds, this callback here gets executed. That's the default set timeout function. Again, if you were reaching out to the server, you would probably also trigger some callback once the data is there. In this callback, you then call the dispatch function, which I'm passing as argument, which gets passed by Redux. And this dispatch function expects what? A JavaScript object with the type, and then the payload. And the payload would be what you probably got back from your server. Here, I'm just setting it equal to name again. So that's an asynchronous task. And if I reload my application here, you see I get an error. Actions must be plain objects. Use custom middleware for async actions. Well, sounds good. That's exactly what we want to do here. So in order to use a custom object, I have to install third-party middleware, or in order to use an asynchronous action here. This middleware is called Redux Func. And I'll also add the save flag to save it in the package.json file. So Redux Func gets installed here. And I want to use it in my store here when I apply the middleware. So here I'll add another import. And I import func from Redux Func. And this middleware is then applied here. I have my logger, and then I apply func. Without parentheses, because func happens to be an export from this package here, which is not a function need to execute, but instead the middleware right away. The middleware Redux then wants to execute. So with that, I'm applying this middleware, and if I save it now, reload my application here, click on change username, you see after 2 seconds it changed to Anna. You also saw that this action was dispatched right away, before then set name was handled here. And that's the asynchronous task which was handled by func, this first one, this undefined one. Let's see it again. If I reload the application, we have max here. If I click on this, we see the first action, and then after 2 seconds we just see the second action, set name, and we see that now the name was indeed changed. And that's the func middleware at work. As you see, it's really easy. We only added one package and then added the middleware, and then we were able to use an asynchronous task here. So Redux Func makes using asynchronous dispatching here really simple. Sometimes, or probably oftentimes, you'll not use a timeout function here, I'm commenting all of this out here, but instead you will probably use a promise. So it would be convenient if you could still return your JavaScript object where you have a type of, let's say, setName, and then you have a payload which is a promise. So let's say this is a new promise. Since we're using ES6, we can use the promise here. And let me quickly reorganize this. So we have the promise here. Promise, as you might be aware, otherwise definitely check out some ES6 resources, has a callback or has a function as an argument. This constructor of the promise has a function as an argument, where the function has two inputs, two arguments, resolve and reject, which again are functions we can call. And then here, in this promise, or in this function we pass to the promise constructor, I'll again create a timeout function. Again, if promise is totally new to you, definitely have a look at some ES6 resources. And in this timeout callback here, inside of the promise, or this function passed to the promise, I'll then call resolve after 2 seconds here, let's say. And I'll resolve the name. So the promise is resolved. And this would be a typical setup where you reach out to the server through some kind of library which also uses promises and which will also resolve in the end. And then it would be nice if you could simply use your, well, promise call here or your server call here which returns your promise. So I'm simulating this here. Now if I save this, click on that, now I get an error again because Redux Thunk is not able to handle this and Redux also isn't by default. For this case, we would use another third-party package. npm install, it's called Redux Promise Middleware. And the name is very clear about what it does. In my store.js file, I'll import this middleware. Import promise from Redux Promise middleware. Oh, I didn't add it to the package.json, did I? Let me quickly add the save flag so that it is there once I ship this to the repository, to the GitHub repo. So now I have my promise middleware and I'll add it to my apply middleware function here, promise, and this again is a package where I need to execute it. And you can find out such things, of course, in the official documentation of the packages. So, importing Redux Promise middleware, should have it here too. Yes, I do. So with that, if I save this, reload my application, click on this, we don't get the error message, but we also don't see the name change here, though no error message happens. We see set name being called and then set name fulfilled. And what's this fulfilled thing? We haven't set this up, right? Well, that's done by this third-party package, by the Redux middleware promise package. It takes our action name, set name, and adds pending, fulfilled, the state it currently is in. So in order to actually do something, I need to then change this here in the reducer to set name fulfilled. I don't change my action here. This is still set name. But here in my reducer, I'm listening to set name fulfilled. So again, if I reload this, click on this. Now you saw it change to Anna because now set name fulfilled is handled by my reducer. So that's the alternative way if you're using a promise. And you may use whichever way you prefer. You can either use the commented out one with the Thunk middleware, and of course you could also use a promise in here, that would also work. Or if you know, well, it's gonna be a promise and I want to take the easier way for that promise with this promise middleware, well then this approach here is the right one. Just make sure to listen to _fulfilled here at the end. And also make sure to check out the official GitHub repositories with the documentation on these packages, on this middleware, to learn more about them and learn how to use them, how to configure them, and so on. But that are the basics about handling asynchronous tasks in your ReactJS Redux application.